Michel Foucault is one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. His work has inspired many philosophers, sociologists, and theorists. For some people, Foucault is much more than a philosopher, because his work explores various domains that have nothing to do with philosophy. Some people see him as a social commentator or a historian, even though Foucault himself didn't like this term. His work often explores the relationship between power and knowledge, and in the previous video, we explored this relationship by tracing the evolution of the meaning of madness. And today we're going to do the same thing, but with the treatment of criminals. We're going to explore his most famous book, Discipline and Punish: The Birth of the Prison. The book was published in 1975, and it traces the evolution of the Western penal system and its underlying objectives. At first, this book might seem like a history of criminology and how we've treated criminals over time. But in reality, Foucault is making a much deeper point of where power lies in society and how it's always connected to knowledge. He's also making the case that the rise of the modern prison led to the emergence of the Disciplinary Society. So let's get into it. Let's highlight Foucault's central question. How did a system of punishment centered on torture, a ritual marked by the sovereign's vengeance, give way to a punishment that seems to be free of all physical pain? That is to say, of the pain that is felt by the body itself. In other words, what contributed to this shift? What social, economic, and political factors led to the creation of the modern prison we know today? The book begins with a description of the punishment of Robert François Damiens, who was brutally executed for trying to assassinate King Louis XV in 1757. The description is very detailed and extremely violent. The aim of the execution wasn't only to punish the criminal, but to publicly show what happens when you challenge the king's authority. In other words, what happens when you threaten the power in place. The execution acted as a public display of power, a spectacle intended to send a clear message. For Foucault, this reveals the true function of the penal system in the 18th century. It wasn't about justice or fairness. It was about maintaining power and social order. However, this system wasn't efficient and had to change for several reasons. Public punishments did deter people from committing crimes, but they also had unexpected consequences that needed to be addressed. For example, the population might sympathize with the criminals and see the punishments as too extreme, which could lead them to question the authority and view the king as a tyrant. Another issue was that public punishments taught the population how to respond to any injustice. They could clearly see who held power and how punishments were carried out. So in the event of social problems like injustice, famine, or war, the population knew exactly who to blame and how to punish them. Think of how Louis XVI was executed during the French Revolution. This was a perfect example that showed the people in power that something had to change. The will of the people had an influence on who stayed in power, even in a monarchy. Staying in power then became a vulnerable task and required more subtle strategies. Before we explore these strategies, let's highlight another key factor that contributed to the rise of the modern prison. Under the old regime, Foucault notes there were forms of illegalisms, or illegal actions that were sometimes tolerated depending on the social class. These actions were considered outside the boundaries of legality. In this case, laws and orders weren't always enforced, allowing society to function more smoothly and efficiently. For example, poor people were allowed to steal some goods for survival. This was called the illegalism of goods, while the bourgeoisie had a legalism of rights, which allowed them to manipulate the law for economic gain. This included tax evasion or exploiting loopholes in trade regulations. These illegalisms were tolerated to maintain social order or serve economic purposes. However, this tolerance began to change by the end of the 18th century, which marked the beginning of important penal reforms. The rise of bourgeois wealth and the growing general population led to a decline in tolerance for illegal actions by the lower classes. What the bourgeoisie did remained acceptable, while what the lower classes did was seen as unacceptable and had to be punished. In this context, penal reform focused on repressing the illegalism of goods, mainly targeting the lower classes. The goal was to suppress these illegalisms more systematically to maintain social order. Generally speaking, the poor, the unemployed, and other marginalized groups were viewed as a potential source of social instability. And with the rise of industrial capitalism, it became even more important to discipline these groups because they were seen as a potential labor force. They just had to be controlled and disciplined. Foucault explains that these factors led to a fundamental shift in how Western society treated criminals, especially between 1757 and 1837. In this context, several methods of punishment were debated, and the modern prison emerged as the dominant solution. The modern prison wasn't simply a reaction to one issue. issue, but a solution to multiple challenges in maintaining power and order. As states became more bureaucratic and less reliant on monarchies, power needed to operate through institutions, rules, and systems. To establish new principles for regulating, refining, and universalizing the art of punishment. To standardize its application, to reduce its economic and political cost by increasing its effectiveness and extending its circuits. In short, to constitute a new economy and a new technology of the power to punish. These are no doubt the essential reasons for penal reform in the 18th and 19th centuries. This shift aimed to move punishment away from the public space and place it behind closed doors. It changed from being a public display of power to something hidden, concealed, and abstract. These changes reshaped how power was maintained and how social order was enforced, making it harder to locate where power truly lies in society. Foucault presents a striking contrast from the old methods of punishment. He shows a rigid daily schedule from a modern prison about 81 years after the public execution. This timetable reflects the shift to a disciplinary system that controls prisoners' behavior, rather than punishing their bodies in public. This new approach is what defines the modern prison, where strict and regimented schedules occupy every moment. Instead of using public and violent spectacles of torture, punishment becomes more restrained and focused on reforming the individual. The aim was to make the prisoners more docile and useful for society. The dynamic of power had to evolve, and the punishments had to change. Foucault calls this the age of punitive sobriety. We can see it as a more efficient and effective way of maintaining power over people. Discipline is no longer simply an art of distributing bodies, of extracting time from them, and of accumulating it, but of composing forces in order to obtain an efficient machine. The modern prison focuses on discipline more than anything else. It became a tool to discipline and recondition prisoners for conformity and productivity, aligning with the needs of the capitalist system. Activities followed strict timetables, movements were timed, physical exercises were enforced, and both bodies and minds were regularly examined. This was really important for reformation, as discipline showed that prisoners could reintegrate into society and become active participants in the community. To achieve optimal discipline, Foucault argues that there is a three-step framework that was incredibly efficient and that kept prisoners under control and in order. It consisted of surveillance, normalization, and examination. So the prisoners were constantly watched and were given a standard for the ideal behavior of a prisoner. So essentially what to think and how to behave. And their actions were constantly examined by the authorities to see if they conformed to this standard. By implementing this framework, the people in power maintained order and control over prisoners in an efficient and non-violent manner. For Foucault, this method came from the work of the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham, particularly from the concept of the Panopticon. The Panopticon is a circular building with a central observation tower surrounded by an outer ring of cells. Its purpose was to improve surveillance and make it more efficient. Each cell is visible from the tower, but the tower is designed in a way that inmates can't see inside it. This creates a state of permanent visibility, where inmates behave as if they're always being watched, even though they can't tell if the guard is watching. This is the ideal prison design because inmates will always self-regulate and monitor themselves. They internalize surveillance and discipline, making the system extremely efficient. Power becomes part of the inmates themselves, or we can say that the inmates become agents of the power in place. By regulating themselves, they actively contribute to maintaining the existing power structure and social order. In this new approach to punishment, power is no longer centralized or easy to locate. It becomes diffuse, operating through networks or micropowers, as Foucault calls them. Micropowers here refer to small diffuse forms of power that operate on a local or individual level, rather than being centralized in one authority. This form of power isn't imposed from above, but instead functions through a network of relationships and is internalized by individuals, making them govern themselves. For Foucault, the goal of the modern penal system isn't justice or fairness. It is to discipline prisoners and maintain power and social order. In other words, it's not very different from the old system. The methods evolved, but the objectives remain the same. Let's pause for a moment. You might say that so far we've only discussed the concept of power, but what about knowledge? How does it fit into this discussion? The constant monitoring of prisoners made them obedient and easy to study. They were a perfect source of knowledge. This allowed those in power to collect and organize knowledge about various subjects. A scientific approach to crimes and criminals emerged. Prisons became places where criminals were systematically studied, improving fields like criminology, psychology, psychiatry, and sociology. Criminals were observed and analyzed to understand their behavior, motivations, and deviations. This allowed authorities to classify people as normal or deviant and create methods to correct behavior behavior. Detailed records, surveillance, and interrogations of prisoners helped improve techniques for managing, disciplining, and reforming them. By analyzing patterns of crime and behavior, the state could better predict and prevent criminal activity. A perfect example of this is the series Mindhunter, which perfectly portrays this process. This knowledge also includes the know-how of controlling bodies, such as schedules, surveillance methods, and reward-punishment systems. That's why for Foucault, power and knowledge are inseparable. Power creates knowledge because the ability to observe and study prisoners comes from the prison's power structure. Knowledge in turn strengthens power, because the insights gained from studying prisoners improve the effectiveness of disciplinary practices, creating a positive feedback loop. By extracting and using this knowledge, prisons not only controlled prisoners, but also established norms and techniques that influence society as a whole. This is why Foucault sees modern prison as a key enabler to the rise of the disciplinary society. And this leads us to our next question. How does the concept of the Panopticon relate to society as a whole? The concept of the Panopticon isn't just an ideal structure for controlling prisoners. It's the perfect model for controlling human beings. The disciplinary techniques used in prisons spread and created a hierarchy of power throughout society. This knowledge was applied to institutions like schools, factories, mental hospitals, and the military. What these institutions have in common is their reliance on hierarchical surveillance, where everyone is watched, even the watchers. Take the example of a company creating good employees. The only thing they need is to apply Foucault's three-step framework: surveillance, normalization, and examination. As a company, you can put in place surveillance methods through cameras, emails, supervisors, and software tracking. Then all you have to do is define what it means to be a good employee, how they should think, dress, behave, and perform. This will help create a normalized standard to attain. This creates a standard for employees to follow, leading them to police themselves and always be professional. They will self-regulate their behavior and performance, knowing they could be watched at any moment. They'll always make sure to be productive and efficient, even if it means overworking themselves. After all, if the only way to get promoted or earn more money is to play by the rules, then that's exactly what they'll do. Then you start the examination phase, with monthly, quarterly, and yearly performance reviews. These evaluations determine how well employees are doing and how they can improve. In other words, how they can adjust their behavior to better align with the employer's standards. This example shows that the modern prison is the blueprint for the disciplinary society. It's the main way to control human behavior in any institution or any setting. It's so efficient because you become both a subject being controlled while simultaneously enforcing the power structure. You're being watched while also policing yourself and those around you, creating an efficient network of micropowers. So you might ask, what's the purpose of the disciplinary society? In short, the goal is to create obedient, non-rebellious, consuming, tax-paying, and conforming citizens. In other words, useful subjects who follow the standards set by those in power. This is the ideal behavior for the dominant political and economic system. These standards of thought and behavior are shaped by the media, institutions, and the people around us. They influence who we are and form our identity. And this is precisely where power lies in our modern society. It lies in the hands of the people who possess knowledge. Power is in the hands of the people who dictate the very framework we use to understand ourselves and the world around us. This knowledge defines what it means to be human and shapes our reality. These are the people in a position to dictate the dominant scientific, social, and cultural narratives. This knowledge isn't an objective or universal truth. It's simply the findings of the current dominant institutions. Knowledge is first and foremost shaped by historical and cultural contexts. And this conclusion leads us to Foucault's other book, The Order of Things, which explores this idea in detail, but we'll save that for another video. Thank you for watching.